Boarding pass ready.
Get that phone out of my face.
Watch out! Take that! Ah!
Stop! Don't touch him!
You don't belong here.
Get out of my way.
No, get out!
Stop, you're hurting me.
You think you can talk to me like that? Take this. Ugh. You don't belong here. Move. Sir, please let go of him. I said move, now.
Ah, that hurt.
Sir, I'm gonna have to ask you to step away. I told you to move. Move! Get your hands off me. This is harassment. Out now! I'm not going. You think you're safe. Stop breathing like that.
Boots. Sir, you need to stand up right now. Elijah Cross did not stand up. He sat in seat 2A with his hands flat on his knees, his boarding pass glowing on the phone screen in his lap, and he looked at the two security officers filling the aisle the way a man looks at weather he has already decided not to run from. Boots. Did either of you actually look at my boarding pass? Neither of them answered. That was the moment, before the aisle, before the jet bridge, before any of it, that would later get replayed 11 million times on a screen that had nothing to do with the plane at all. Boots. But we are getting ahead of ourselves, because 6 hours earlier, none of this had a name yet. 6 hours earlier, it was just a man in a parking garage, alone, at 20 minutes to 5 in the morning. Boots. Denver International Airport in the dark is a different building than it is at noon. The tent-shaped roof outside catches the runway lights instead of the sun, and the terminal underneath has the hollow quiet of a church before the first service. Boots. Elijah Cross walked through that quiet wearing dark jeans, a gray button-down with the sleeves rolled twice, and a brown leather duffel bag with a cracked handle he had refused to replace for 11 years. Boots. No driver, no assistant trailing behind him with a folder. Boots. No one from Ashford Bridge Capital, the firm he had built from a single office above a dry cleaner in Aurora, into a fund that now managed $4 billion in infrastructure assets. Knew he was flying commercial, alone, on the same airline his firm was 72 hours from either saving or walking away from. Boots. Ashford Bridge was set to release $8 billion in expansion financing to Continental Vista Airlines. The money would fund 14 new regional jets, modernize 3 maintenance hubs, and protect an estimated 14,000 jobs across 6 states. Boots. Elijah had read every page of the due diligence file twice. What he had not done, what his board had actually argued against, was fly the airline himself without warning anyone, to see what an ordinary Tuesday actually felt like from inside a coach seat and a first-class seat and a gate line. Boots. His chief financial officer had called it theater. Elijah had told her that numbers could be adjusted before an audit. Boots. A gate agent's face could not. Near the security checkpoint, an older man in a canvas jacket fumbled his boarding pass out of a folder of what looked like insurance paperwork, and the whole stack slid out from under his arm and fanned across the tile. Boots. Elijah crouched without thinking about it, gathered the pages before a rolling suitcase could scatter them further, and handed them back in order. Boots. The man thanked him twice, embarrassed by his own hands. Boots. Elijah told him the floor moved faster than either of them that morning, and the man laughed, and that was the whole exchange. 5 seconds, forgotten by everyone except the one person, standing 8 feet away, who had watched it and decided, without a single word, exactly who Elijah Cross was. Boots. Her name was Diane Whitfield, and she pulled her cream leather tote a few inches closer to her body as Elijah passed, the way a person does when they believe, quietly and completely, that they have just avoided something. Boots. She did not look at him. She did not need to. Elijah felt his jaw tighten by a fraction of an inch, and then he did what he had done 10,000 times before in 10,000 rooms, exactly like this one. Boots. He kept walking at the same pace, because his mother had told him a long time ago, in a kitchen in Montbello with the radio playing low, that in rooms like this, some people would always assume he was there to carry someone else's bags, and the correct response was never to argue. Boots. Let them be wrong, she'd said, without ever helping them feel right. He had booked seat 2A 28 days earlier. The same afternoon, he'd signed the preliminary term sheet with Continental Vista's board. Boots. By the time he scanned his boarding pass and stepped onto the jet bridge for Flight 714 to Washington Dulles, that seat belonged to him in every database, every manifest, every system the airline owned. Boots. What happened to it over the next 40 minutes would not be an accident. It would be a decision made by 4 different people, each of whom believed they were only being reasonable. Boots. He settled into 2A, pushed his duffel into the overhead bin, and looked out at the wing, where frost from the overnight cold had collected in a thin silver seam along the edge and was just beginning to catch the first gray light. Boots. In his jacket pocket, where it always rode when he traveled, was a brass luggage tag the size of a matchbook, stamped with the initials T. Boots. C and the words, "Handle with care." It had belonged to his father, Thomas Cross, who had worked the tarmac at Old Stapleton Airport for 22 years loading bags into the bellies of planes he was never once invited to sit in. Boots. Thomas Cross had been removed from a commercial flight himself in 1987, not for anything he'd done, but for sitting in a seat a paying passenger insisted belonged to him. Boots. Elijah had been 11 years old when his father came home that night and didn't speak at dinner. He had carried that tag on every flight since he was old enough to buy his own ticket. Boots. Keep that in mind. It comes back. For a few minutes the cabin felt like any other Tuesday morning. Then he heard a voice behind him say, "I think there's been some kind of mix-up," and the voice belonged to a man named Preston Whitfield. Boots. Preston was 61, dressed in a charcoal travel blazer that had never once touched a dry cleaning conveyor belt without a valet attached to it, and he checked his watch before he addressed anyone directly. The way men do when they've spent 30 years being, the reason meetings started late, instead of the reason they started on time. Boots. Diane stood behind him, tote bag against her hip, her eyes moving between Elijah and the seatback number above his head. Boots. Preston did not speak to Elijah. He raised 2 fingers toward the forward galley, the way a man flags a waiter he has decided is beneath conversation, and a flight attendant named Renata Voss appeared within seconds, her customer service smile already fully assembled before she understood what she was walking into. Boots. Mr. Whitfield, good morning. Is everything all right? Preston held out both boarding passes. He had seat 2B, Diane had 5C. Boots. He explained, patiently, the way a man explains something he does not expect to have to explain twice, that Continental Vista's system had separated a married couple who flew this route 11 times a year, that they always sat together in this row, that surely something could be arranged. Boots. Renata checked both screens. Then she opened her tablet and pulled Elijah's reservation. Seat 2A, full first-class fare, confirmed 28 days earlier. Boots. No service flag, no upgrade code. Nothing that asked for a second look. There was no error to fix. There was nothing to interpret at all. Boots. She glanced at Elijah. She glanced at Diane's tote bag, at the platinum card sleeve visible through the mesh pocket. Boots. And then she said the 4 words that would end up quoted, 11 months later, in a federal complaint filing. Boots. Let me see what I can do. Elijah had closed the audit report he'd been reading. A file, as it happened, on Continental Vista's own passenger complaint backlog, 1 line of it highlighted from the night before. A complaint stops meaning anything the moment the system decides what happened before a single person reads it. Boots. He kept his thumb between the pages. Renata leaned in close enough that Elijah could smell her perfume over the recycled cabin air. Boots. Mr. Cross, she said, we do have another first-class seat available in row 8. Would you be willing to help us keep the Whitfields together? Boots. Row 8, seat D, sat directly beside the lavatory. Its overhead bin was already jammed with 2 other passengers' bags. Boots. It had no window. Why can't the passenger in 5C simply sit in 5C, Elijah asked. Renata's smile held, the warmth behind it did not. Boots. They're traveling together. This would only be a small adjustment. Small. The word landed on him with a weight it had carried before. In hotel lobbies, at closing table negotiations where he was the only black man in the room, and somehow the last one whose credentials got checked, on tarmacs just like this one. Boots. Small adjustment, small courtesy, small concession. It was a word that only ever got attached to something that already belonged to him. Boots. I'd like to keep the seat I paid for, Elijah said. His voice did not rise. Preston checked his watch again. Boots. I'm sure he'll come around once you explain it more clearly, he said to Renata, as though Elijah were not sitting 18 inches away with his name printed on the overhead display. Boots. Renata did not correct him. Diane leaned toward the flight attendant and lowered her voice. Not nearly enough. Was he perhaps upgraded at the gate? Boots. I purchased this seat, Elijah said. I was only asking. Diane smiled quickly, and the question had already done exactly what it was built to do. It had placed Elijah's right to seat 2A under review, while Preston's preference floated somewhere above suspicion entirely. Boots. Renata looked at Elijah's rolled-up sleeves, his scuffed duffel bag, then back at Preston's platinum status glowing on her tablet. Boots. She had the correct answer in front of her the entire time. She chose to treat it as a problem anyway. Boots. May I see your boarding pass again? You already checked it. I need to verify it directly. He handed over his phone. Boots. She scrolled down, scrolled back up, found precisely what she had found the first time, and asked for identification anyway. Boots. He knew this road. He had driven it in the dark more times than he could count. First the ticket, then the ID, then the question that always came folded inside both of them, unspoken but perfectly audible. How did you get here? Boots. He handed over his Colorado driver's license. She held it beside the phone and compared the photograph for longer than any photograph on Earth requires. Boots. Behind her, a junior flight attendant named Aliyah Monroe had been standing near the galley with a meal service checklist balanced on her forearm. Watching the exchange the way you watch a fender bender you already know is about to become a pileup. Boots. She pulled up Elijah's reservation on her own tablet. Full fare, booked nearly a month out, seat selected at purchase. Boots. Identity confirmed at the gate. No flags of any kind. Nothing that asked for a second look, except the second look someone had decided to give it anyway. Boots. She stepped closer and said quietly, "His ticket is fine, Renata. I can see that," Renata said. "I'm making sure." Boots. Making sure of what? Elijah asked. Renata handed back the license without answering. "This is routine verification, sir." Elijah looked down the aisle. Boots. Preston had set a heavy leather briefcase across the walkway while he helped Diane with her coat, and a boarding passenger had to turn sideways just to get past it. Boots. Renata glanced over. "Mr. Whitfield, if you could keep the aisle clear when possible." Preston nodded and did not move the briefcase an inch. Boots. She did not ask to see his ticket. She did not ask for his identification. She turned back to Elijah instead, and something had shifted behind her eyes. The practiced warmth had gone, replaced by something colder, more careful, the look of a person who has just understood she is now dealing with someone who intends to keep a record. Boots. "There's really no need to make this formal," she said. "I'm asking you to document what happened," Elijah answered. Preston set a hand briefly on Renata's elbow and steered her 2 steps toward the galley. His voice dropped low, but not nearly low enough. Boots. Diane, he said, was getting anxious. They had flown this airline for over a decade. Boots. If Continental Vista couldn't manage something as simple as a seating request for its most loyal customers, he would be reaching out to corporate leadership personally. He knew people on the board, he added. The way a man drops a name he has never actually met, but has definitely donated near. Boots. Renata nodded and stepped away to make a call. The man she called was named Walter Pruitt, 52 years old, 11 years in Denver ground operations, thinking about exactly one thing at that moment, which was closing the aircraft door before the departure slot expired, and he had to explain a delay to 3 separate supervisors. Boots. Renata gave him the compressed shorthand airline staff use with each other, the kind that skips full sentences entirely. Platinum member. Boots. Seating conflict. Passenger in 2A not cooperating. Walter pulled the manifest. He saw Elijah's confirmed assignment. He saw Preston's 14 years of platinum status. Boots. And he understood, in the particular math of a man with 90 seconds and no appetite for a second phone call, that if he refused the request, Renata would call back, and if he approved it, he could close the ticket and move to the next fire before the smoke even cleared. Boots. He opened the seat modification panel and selected a code labeled Member Recovery Review, a code that existed for genuine booking errors and documented service failures involving elite status travelers. Boots. It did not exist to override a valid occupied confirmed seat because another passenger simply preferred it. A warning appeared on his screen. Seat occupied by confirmed passenger. Manal res repures operational justification. Boots. Walter dismissed it. A second warning appeared. He dismissed that one too, the way you dismiss a spam email between real ones, and at 6:41 Boots. 8 minutes after Elijah had boarded without a single incident, seat 2A flipped from confirmed to under review. Boots. On Aliyah's tablet, the small green dot beside Elijah's name turned amber. She checked the timestamp twice. Her stomach dropped somewhere below the cabin floor. Boots. Without a word to anyone, she raised her phone, photographed the screen before the timestamp could scroll out of frame, opened a blank email draft, attached the image, and slid the phone face down into her apron pocket. Boots. She did not yet know who the safe person to send it to was. She only knew, with a certainty that surprised her, that she was not going to let this particular moment disappear as though it had never happened. Boots. Here is the part worth remembering, because it comes back later and it matters more than anything said out loud in that cabin. Nobody who changed that seat had a single legitimate reason to. Boots. Not one. Renata returned to the row. The system is currently reviewing your seat assignment. Elijah raised his own phone. Boots. The Continental Vista app still showed 2A as confirmed. The change hadn't synced to his end yet. Who changed it? Boots. Renata glanced at her tablet, then toward the galley, and said nothing at all. Across the aisle, a woman named Dorothy Vance had lowered her reading glasses onto the bridge of her several minutes earlier and had angled her phone low against the seat back in front of her, aimed through the gap between two headrests. Boots. She was 74 years old, a retired federal appellate judge who had spent 31 years on the bench, watching records get shaped before facts were settled, and she recognized the shape of it instantly. Boots. She kept the camera steady. She said nothing, not yet. Preston stood with his arms crossed, watching the exchange the way a man watches a problem he already believes has been solved in his favor. Boots. Diane straightened in her temporary seat. The cabin had gone quiet in a very particular way. The way a room goes quiet when everyone in it has decided to watch without appearing to watch. Boots. Renata leaned toward Elijah again. Seat 8D is still available. We can have your bag relocated in under a minute. Boots. Can I get the reason for the seat change in writing? There's no need for paperwork. We're offering an equivalent first-class seat. Boots. It's not equivalent, and my seat was confirmed until someone changed the record. Preston exhaled through his nose and checked his watch a third time. Boots. Elijah turned toward him for the first time since this began. I'd like to know why my seat changed after you asked for it. Boots. I didn't ask for anything that belonged to you, Preston said. I asked the airline to take care of its longtime customers. Boots. He put a slight, deliberate weight on the last two words, as though 14 years of loyalty points conferred a claim stronger than a paid, confirmed boarding pass. Boots. Diane adjusted the strap of her tote. There are certain ways people are expected to conduct themselves in a cabin like this. Boots. That was when Dorothy Vance spoke for the first time, without raising her voice at all. What behavior are you referring to exactly? Boots. Diane turned, startled, and her expression hardened the moment she registered the phone still resting in Dorothy's hand. I wasn't speaking to you. Boots. I know, Dorothy said. I'm asking what he's done. Renata stepped between them. Mr. Cross, I need you to lower your voice. Boots. It was, by every measurable account, the quietest anyone in that exchange had spoken all morning. Elijah studied her for a long moment, giving her time to hear her own sentence played back. Boots. Is my voice louder than Mr. Whitfield's? She did not answer. She unlocked the notes field on her tablet and typed with her thumb, and Dorothy, zooming her camera in from across the aisle, caught most of the sentence forming there. Passenger becoming resistant to reasonable accommodation. Boots. Clean, official, and precisely engineered to fold Preston's pressure, Diane's insinuation, the wrongful seat change, and Elijah's simple request for an explanation into a single phrase that made him the problem. Boots. Aaliyah saw the note from the edge of the galley curtain. He hasn't refused a safety instruction, she said, quiet but clear enough to carry. Boots. Renata's head turned sharply. Come with me. She pulled Aaliyah behind the galley divider and let the curtain fall. Her voice, when it came, was flat and low. Boots. You're still on a 90-day performance review. Do not insert yourself into something outside your assignment. Aaliyah said nothing. She went back to her checklist with her hands trembling slightly, and she did not delete the draft in her email. Boots. Captain James Holt entered the cabin 4 minutes later, and he made the single most consequential decision of the entire morning in about 11 seconds, without realizing it. Boots. He did not ask Aaliyah what she had observed from the galley. He did not check the timestamp on the seat status change. Boots. He did not ask Walter Pruitt why a confirmed seat had been manually overridden. He walked in with the departure clock already running behind his eyes, and by the time he reached row 2, The problem had already been named for him by the person who'd called him back there. Boots. Preston stood when he saw the captain's uniform. "Captain, I appreciate you stepping in." Holt glanced at him and Diane. "Boots. Are you and your wife all right?" "We're fine," Preston said, "but this has gone on long enough." Holt nodded and turned to Elijah, and Elijah noticed the sequence immediately. The people who had started this were being treated as the ones who needed protecting. "Boots." He drew a slow breath. "I need you to check the time the seat status was changed. The issue is no longer limited to the seat assignment," Holt said. "Boots. My crew has made a request and I need your cooperation." Dorothy spoke again, without lifting her phone or her voice. "Boots." The cooperation issue started the moment he asked to see the record. "Ma'am, please let the crew handle this." "They're handling it on camera," Dorothy said, and her voice carried the length of the cabin without her needing to raise it even slightly. Boots. She had not needed volume to make a point since roughly the Clinton administration. Holt turned back to Elijah. "Will you accept seat 8D?" Boots. "I had a valid ticket for 2A. I showed my boarding pass. I showed identification. The seat changed after..." Boots. "Whitfield requested it. No one has identified a safety concern." He said each sentence flatly, evenly, not as an argument but as something closer to a deposition, a record being built in real time, one fact at a time, with nothing extra attached to any of them. Boots. Holt checked his own watch. Ground operations had already radioed once about the departure window. He saw two paths in front of him. Boots. One meant pulling the seat change log and asking who had authorized a manual override on an occupied, confirmed seat, a path that would take 15 minutes he genuinely did not have. Boots. The other meant removing the passenger who kept asking uncomfortable questions about it, a path that would take 90 seconds. Boots. "Step into the jet bridge with me," Holt said. "We can speak privately." Elijah went very still. "If I step through that door, will I be allowed back on this aircraft?" Boots. Holt paused a beat too long. "That depends on how the conversation goes." Elijah understood the entire architecture of what was being offered to him in that pause. Boots. If he stood and walked out on his own, it would be logged as a voluntary departure. If he objected once he was through that door and off camera, any description of his behavior could be written however the crew wanted it written, with no witnesses and no video. Boots. The door was not an invitation to talk. It was a way to make his own removal look like something he had chosen. Boots. He stayed in his seat. "You've already decided you want me to stand up on my own, so the incident report reads cleaner." Boots. Color rose fast along Holt's neck. Preston leaned forward. "That is exactly the attitude we've been dealing with." Renata opened the incident notes and typed a new line, and Aaliyah, watching from the galley, read it as it appeared. "Passenger challenging captain's authority." Boots. She looked at Elijah's hands. They had not moved from his knees the entire time. Preston looked at the captain with the particular confidence of a man who believes two people have just silently agreed on something. Boots. People who travel at this level know that sometimes you have to be flexible. He meant it genuinely, as ordinary common sense. Boots. He seemed entirely unaware that the sentence required Elijah to accept that sitting in a seat he had purchased was somehow the inflexible position in the room. Boots. Elijah turned to him one final time, and for the first time that morning the strain showed, not in his voice, which stayed level, but in the muscles along his jaw. Boots. "I followed every rule there is, and you still need me to prove I belong here." Preston looked away. Diane straightened the strap of her tote again, a small tick she would repeat, unconsciously, in a deposition 8 months later. Boots. Holt reached for the interphone and pressed the button connecting him to ground operations. His voice was quiet. It carried across the frozen cabin anyway. Boots. "Ground security to the aircraft. First-class cabin. Passenger removal." Aaliyah looked down at the screenshot still sitting in her email draft. Boots. The crew had manufactured a situation, written it into an official record, and was now calling security to respond to the very record they had invented. Boots. She was standing in the middle of it, and in 6 minutes on that flight, not one person had asked her a single direct question. Boots. Diane Whitfield stood up from her temporary seat across the aisle, her voice pitched loud enough, now that 3 rows behind her turned to look. Boots. "This is exactly the kind of entitlement Preston and I deal with every time we fly this route," she said to no one in particular and to everyone at once. Boots. "We are members of this airline, we have status, and instead of simply moving, He's decided to make an example out of a family trying to sit together. Boots. A man in seat 4A, a stranger to all of them, murmured something under his breath that might have been agreement or might have been discomfort. It was impossible to tell, and that ambiguity was exactly the kind of cover a cabin like this one was built to provide. Boots. Preston folded his arms and nodded along with his wife's version of the morning, as though it were simply the record correcting itself. Boots. Elijah said nothing to either of them. He had learned, a long time ago, that explaining himself to people who had already decided the ending only ever gave them more material to work with. Boots. He looked instead at Aliyah, who was standing very still near the galley curtain, with her hands pressed flat against her apron, and for one full second their eyes met across the length of the cabin. Boots. Neither of them said a word. But something passed between them anyway, the particular silent understanding of two people who both knew exactly what was happening, and both understood, for entirely different reasons, that saying so out loud right now would cost one of them a job and the other a boarding pass. Boots. Officer Dale Kessler walked down the jet bridge and into the cabin 2 minutes later with a second officer behind him, carrying a radio call that had told him almost nothing true. Boots. Passenger refusing crew instruction. First-class seat dispute, no mention of a boarding pass, no mention of a manually overridden reservation. Boots. No mention of 2 dismissed system warnings, entered 8 minutes after a paying customer had boarded without incident. Kessler walked past every other row without a glance and stopped at seat 2A. Boots. Mr. Cross, we need you to come with us. Elijah looked up. Am I being accused of a crime? No. Boots. Have I threatened anyone? Kessler glanced at Holt, waiting on the captain's authority rather than his own judgment. Dorothy held her phone steady and did not lower it an inch. Boots. Renata stood with her tablet, pressed flat against her chest, eyes forward, refusing to look at row 2 directly. Alia's face had gone the particular blank that a person's face goes when they are holding themselves very carefully in place, afraid that any expression at all might be read as taking a side. Boots. Elijah looked at Kessler for a long moment. Then he nodded once, reached up and pulled his duffel bag down from the overhead bin. Boots. His hand trembled slightly, closing around the strap. He didn't try to hide it, and he didn't try to make it bigger than it was either. Boots. When Kessler reached for the bag, Elijah shifted it out of reach and carried the weight himself. He stood in the aisle until his breathing steadied, counting to 4 in his head without letting the count show on his face, and then he walked toward the front of the aircraft. Boots. At the cabin door, he stopped. He did not see Dorothy's phone still recording. He did not know about the screenshot sitting in Aliyah's drafts folder. Boots. He only saw Aliyah's face, the particular tension of someone who knows the true version of something and has not yet decided what she's willing to do about it. Boots. He didn't know her name. He spoke to the expression instead. Whatever you saw in here, remember it accurately. Boots. Aliyah lowered her eyes. The cabin door closed behind him. The jet bridge was cold, lit by the flat, colorless fluorescents that make everything underneath them look slightly less real than it is. Boots. Kessler walked beside him. The second officer followed a few steps back. Their shoes made hard, clean sounds against the metal walkway. Boots. You could have avoided all this by just taking the other seat, Kessler said. He said it without malice. The way people say things they genuinely believe are obvious. Boots. Elijah stopped walking. Did you read my boarding pass before you came onto that plane? Kessler's jaw tightened. He hadn't. Boots. That's not the issue at this point. It was the issue before you ever got there. The crew gave an instruction, and you followed it without asking what it was based on. Boots. Kessler had no answer for that, which meant, in some narrow and uncomfortable way, that Elijah had already won an argument the other man didn't know they were having. Boots. They reached the gate area in silence. Elijah pulled out his phone and made one call, standing perfectly still in the middle of the concourse while travelers streamed around him in both directions like water around a stone. Boots. Freeze the expansion funding, he said. All of it. Effective immediately, and preserve every record tied to this flight, manifest, seat change logs, crew notes, camera footage from the gate and jet bridge, everything. Boots. A pause. I don't care what time it is in New York. Call them now. 6 words moved through Continental Vista's leadership by 8:15 Boots. M. And they were not about seating. They were. The Ashford Bridge funding has been frozen. Boots. Gordon Reyes, the airline CEO, was 2 bites into a bagel in his kitchen in Bethesda, when his general counsel called and said the words voluntary preservation demand and removal incident in the same sentence, and Gordon's first question, the one that would define how badly the next 11 months went for him, was not what happened to the passenger. Boots. It was how bad is the exposure. By 10 that morning, an internal review team had pulled the manifest. By noon, they had the seat change log with its 2 dismissed warnings, time-stamped 6:41 Boots. 8 minutes after boarding, with Walter Pruitt's employee ID attached to the override. Boots. By 2 in the afternoon, someone had located Dorothy Vance's video, uploaded that morning to a small public account with fewer than 900 followers, and by 4 it had 90,000 views, and was climbing in a way corporate communications had no plan for at all. Boots. Vivian Cole, the airline's newly hired communications director, watched the first draft of the official statement land in her inbox, the one that called the incident a seating misunderstanding that was resolved appropriately by the flight crew, and she deleted 3 of its 4 paragraphs before sending it back with a single line. We are not writing a statement that will be contradicted by video evidence within 48 hours. Boots. Draft it again, and this time start with what actually happened. That single act of refusal would end up costing her the loyalty of half the executive floor, and eventually, her job at Continental Vista entirely, though not for the reason anyone in that building expected. Boots. Aaliyah Monroe sat in her car in the employee lot for 40 minutes that afternoon before she opened her email drafts folder, found the screenshot she'd taken 8 hours earlier, and forwarded it. Not to her supervisor, not to Renata, but to the airline's newly established ethics hotline, with 4 lines of her own account attached and her name signed at the bottom. Boots. She was still on a 90-day performance review. She sent it anyway. Marjorie Klein, a retired Continental Vista compliance auditor living in Baltimore, saw the story break on her tablet 2 days later while drinking coffee at her kitchen table, and she recognized something in the shape of it that made her set the cup down slowly. Boots. She walked to her hall closet and pulled out a cardboard banker's box she had kept, unopened, through 2 moves and 1 divorce. 11 years of internal complaint files she had personally flagged before her retirement, each one involving a Black or Latino passenger, each one closed by the airline as resolved. No further action without a single interview ever conducted. Boots. She had almost thrown the box away twice. She called a reporter instead. The story that ran 9 days later was not about 1 seat. Boots. It was about a pattern. 41 prior complaints across 6 years, all following some version of the same shape, all closed the same way, all involving the same 3-seat override codes that ground staff had learned, informally and without ever writing it down anywhere, could be used to move a passenger who wasn't the right fit for a cabin. Boots. The federal investigation that followed took 11 months. What it found was not complicated, even if the sentences describing it were long. Boots. Renata Voss had initiated a manual seat override without operational justification, then documented Elijah's calm, repeated requests for an explanation using language, resistant, challenging authority, that her own airline's incident report guidelines explicitly required to be tied to specific observable conduct, none of which existed on the recording. Boots. She was terminated for cause and lost her flight attendant certification pending a separate review. Walter Pruitt was terminated for dismissing 2 system safety warnings without documentation. Boots. Captain Holt was suspended for 90 days and required to complete a decision-making and conflict management evaluation before returning to duty, not as a formality. Several of its sessions focused on nothing but the difference between receiving a briefing and verifying one. Boots. Officer Dale Kessler was reassigned away from passenger removal incidents, pending a review that produced a new department-wide policy. Airport security could no longer act on a crew removal request without independently confirming the passenger's reservation status first, unless there was an immediate documented safety threat. Boots. Preston and Diane Whitfield were the last piece to fall, and it took the longest because Preston fought it the entire way. Boots. The investigation found that both of them had given the crew misleading statements about being separated by a system error. The truth was, they had simply arrived late and been assigned the only seats remaining and had applied direct pressure, including an implied threat to contact the board, in order to force the removal of a confirmed, paying passenger from a seat that had never belonged to them. Boots. Their platinum membership, worth roughly $40,000 a year in perks and priority upgrades, was permanently revoked under a clause in the loyalty program's own terms, prohibiting members from misrepresenting a situation to staff in order to obtain preferential treatment. Boots. The fallout reached further than either of the Whitfields expected. Preston's development firm had a standing bid pending on a mixed-use contract with the city of Denver, and within a month of his name appearing in the federal filing, 2 council members quietly asked that the vote be tabled pending further review of the applicant's public conduct. Boots. The bid died there without ever officially being rejected. It simply stopped being scheduled. Diane's name was removed from the guest list of a charity gala she had chaired for 6 consecutive years. Boots. The invitation that year came addressed to the committee, not to her. Old friends did not call to explain why. Boots. They simply stopped calling, the way people do when they've decided a friendship has become a liability rather than ended it on purpose. Boots. Preston appealed the decision twice, in writing, both times insisting he had simply asked for a reasonable accommodation, and that the airline was punishing him for the actions of its own employees. Boots. He did not apologize in either letter. Boots. It was only in the 3rd month after the second appeal was denied, after his name had been read aloud in a deposition room by a federal attorney, after his own real estate partners had quietly stopped inviting him to closing dinners, after Diane had stopped answering calls from the 2 friends who'd been on that flight with them, that something in him actually cracked. Boots. It happened privately, in a parking garage outside a law office in downtown Denver, 3 floors below, where he had just spent 90 minutes being questioned under oath about a seat he had never had a legal claim to in the first place. Boots. He sat in his car for a long time before starting the engine. He thought about the sentence he'd said on the plane. People who travel at this level know that sometimes you have to be flexible, and for the first time in 11 months, he heard it the way it must have sounded to everyone else in that cabin. Boots. Not as common sense, as a demand that another man prove, with a boarding pass and a driver's license and his own composure, that he had a right to exist in a seat he had already paid for. Boots. Preston Whitfield did not send an apology. He was not a man built for that kind of sentence yet, and the story does not pretend he became one overnight, just because the ending needed it. Boots. But he did call his attorney the next morning and withdraw the 3rd appeal, and when a reporter asked him for comment 6 weeks later, he said only, "I was wrong about what I thought I was owed," and hung up before she could ask a follow-up question. Boots. It was not redemption. It was, for a man like Preston Whitfield, closer to the truth than he had ever come before. Boots. Simone Fields. No, her name was Alia Monroe, and she remained a flight attendant with Continental Vista. She received no promotion. Boots. She hadn't asked for one, and would have turned it down if it had been offered in exchange for her testimony. Boots. She joined a newly formed passenger advocacy working group instead, reviewing the exact language crew members were permitted to use when documenting passenger behavior. Boots. Its first recommendation was simple. Incident reports could no longer use words like resistant, aggressive, or threatening without a specific physical, observable action attached to each one. Boots. A raised voice had to be described in decibels a reasonable person could picture, not in adjectives a reasonable person could weaponize. Boots. Gordon Reyes resigned as CEO 11 weeks after the story broke, effective immediately with a 2-sentence statement thanking the airline for the years he'd led it and wishing it success in its next chapter. Boots. He made no mention of the investigation, the $40 million passenger equity fund the board would go on to establish, or the man who had been sitting quietly in seat 2A on an ordinary Tuesday morning in October. Boots. Renee Ashcroft, the board chair, delivered the airline's formal statement herself, in front of cameras, without softening a single word of it. Boots. She called the removal of Elijah Cross what it was, unjustified, and acknowledged that the pattern Marjorie Klein had documented reflected systemic failures that predated the current leadership and required a systemic response, not an individual apology. Boots. She thanked Alia Monroe, Dorothy Vance, and Marjorie Klein by name for what each of them had refused to let disappear. Boots. When a reporter called Dorothy Vance afterward to ask how it felt to be named publicly, The retired judge said she appreciated the acknowledgement, but that the video she'd taken wasn't the actual reason for the outcome. Boots. The reason was a man who had been sitting in the seat he was assigned when they tried to remove him from it, and who had responded to every single provocation with specific, factual sentences instead of an emotion anyone could twist into evidence against him. Boots. She said she hoped younger people watching the whole thing understood the difference. Then she wished the reporter a good evening and went back to whatever she'd been doing before the phone rang. Boots. 11 months after Flight 749 left Denver without him, Elijah Cross walked back through that same terminal on an ordinary morning in September. Boots. He wore the same gray button-down and carried the same duffel bag, the crack in its handle a little longer now, the brass tag with his father's initials riding in his jacket pocket exactly where it always rode. Boots. No driver waited at the curb. No one from Ashford Bridge trailed behind him with a folder. At the gate, a small printed notice had been added permanently to the boarding display. Loyalty status of any kind could not be used to modify or override the confirmed seat assignment of another passenger, under any circumstance. Boots. The gate agent scanned his pass and looked up with a brief, unremarkable smile. "Good morning, Mr. Cross. Seat 2A. Boots. He thanked her and walked down the jet bridge. Near the aircraft door, a woman in her 70s was wrestling a rolling bag toward the overhead bin, with the stubborn determination of someone who had decided not to ask for help, and was actively reconsidering that decision. Boots. Elijah stopped. "Would you like a hand with that?" She looked at him, surprised by the question, and nodded. He lifted the bag into the bin and closed it cleanly. Boots. "Thank you," she said. "My arms aren't what they used to be." "Neither is the compartment latch," he said, and she laughed, and he walked back to row 2 and sat down in the seat that had always, technically, legally, in every system that mattered, been his. Boots. The morning light spread across the wing. Frost along its edge caught the first sun and turned silver, exactly the way it had 11 months earlier, on a morning that had started exactly the same way and ended in a completely different world. Boots. No one on the aircraft knew who he was. No one looked up when he passed. The man beside him nodded once over a folded newspaper and went back to reading. Boots. Elijah opened his briefcase and found a new internal briefing waiting inside. A different company, a different quarter, the same kind of work, and he began to read, and somewhere behind his eyes, the way it always did before a door closed. For the last time, he thought of his father setting down a suitcase in 1987 with hands that had learned, that day, exactly what silence was for. Boots. Some fights never announce themselves before they arrive. Boots. They show up at a gate desk, in the narrow aisle of a first-class cabin, in a request for something to be put in writing, and they demand a very specific kind of patience. The kind that doesn't surrender what's true just because the room has decided to disagree with it. The kind that preserves the record before it reaches for anger. The kind that understands the difference between being believed and being powerful, and refuses to settle for only one of the two. Boots. Elijah Cross was believed, in the end, only because a junior flight attendant kept a screenshot she wasn't required to keep. Boots. Only because a retired judge held a phone steady through the gap in 2 headrests. Only because a woman in Baltimore opened a closet she had almost cleared out twice and decided, one more time, not to let the box go. Boots. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you've ever been the person standing quietly at the edge of a room like that one, the one who saw it happen and had to decide, in real time, whether silence was safer than the truth, I'd like to know which way you went. Boots. I read every answer.